That fence is 11 feet over the line, and the line is wherever this board says it is. That was Diane Mercer, president of the Cedar Hollow Estates Homeowners Association for the better part of 9 years, standing at the end of my gravel drive on a Tuesday morning with a clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield. She was talking about the split-rail fence my wife and I had set 41 years ago, the one that runs along the north edge of 3.5 acres that have carried my name on the county rolls since before Cedar Hollow had a name at all. She had a tape measure in one hand and a man with a camera behind her, and she was certain. She was the kind of certain that does not check anything first. What she did not know, standing there in her white linen blazer and her good shoes sinking into the soft ground at the edge of my pasture, was that I am the man who drew the line she was pointing at, not figured it, not guessed at it, drew it, surveyed it, set the irons, recorded the plat with the county, and signed my name and pressed my seal into the corner of the very map her association uses to this day to tell 206 households where their property ends. My name is Walt Brennan. I am 68 years old. For 36 years, I was a licensed land surveyor in this county, and the subdivision Diane Mercer believes she governs sits on ground I measured with my own instrument before her family ever moved to this state. So, let me ask you something before I tell you the rest of it. If someone stood on land you had measured and recorded with your own hands and told you that your fence was in the wrong place because she had decided it was, what would you have done? Would you have pulled out a tape of your own? Or would you have done what I did, which was nothing at all, except go inside and start a folder? I want to take you back because the fence and the clipboard are the end of a long road, and the road matters more than the morning. I grew up 2 counties east of here, the son of a man who poured concrete and a woman who kept the books for 3 different churches because she was the only one any of them trusted with a ledger. I learned numbers at her kitchen table, and I learned to work with my hands, my father's truck. And somewhere between the two, I found the thing I was good at, which was standing in a field with a transit and telling the truth about where things were. There is no opinion in a property corner. There is only the iron pin in the ground, the call in the deed, and the arithmetic that ties them together. I like that about the work. In a world full of people willing to tell you that a line is wherever they say it is, I spent my life proving that a line is exactly where the record says it is, and not 1 inch elsewhere. I married Carol in the autumn of my 24th year. She taught 4th grade for 30 years, and she could quiet a room of 9-year-olds with a look that she also used on me. More than once, when I came home muddy and late and pleased with myself. We bought the 3.5 acres up here when the land was cheap and the road was dirt, and we built the house ourselves over 2 summers, and we raised our daughter in it. I poured the footings the week our loan cleared, and Carol kept the receipts for every board and every box of nails in a shoebox she labeled in her schoolteacher hand. And that shoebox is still on the closet shelf, and I could put my finger on the receipt for the cedar rails of that north fence inside of a minute. She taught me, without ever meaning to, that a paper kept is a fight already half won. Carol passed 4 years ago. In the spring, after a short, hard illness, I will not describe, and I will not dwell on it except to say that the fence she helped me set is not a fence to me. It is her hands and my hands, and a Saturday in 1983 when we argued about whether the corner post should go 6 inches one way or the other. I had my plat and my arithmetic, and I was sure I was right. She stood at the line with her arms crossed and said the pin was the pin, but the post could sit where a person could actually swing the gate. And she was right, and I said it. Where she said, the pin is the law, the post is the life. I have thought about that distinction every day. Since she has been gone, our granddaughter, Maddie, came to live with me the autumn after Carol died. Maddie was 15, then 16 now, my daughter's girl, sent up the mountain to keep an old man company and to finish high school somewhere quiet after a hard couple of years at home. She is the reason the house has noise in it again. She plays music I do not understand while she does her homework at the same kitchen table where my mother taught me to add a column of figures. And she has opinions about everything, and she keeps the dog, a heavy old yellow mutt named Biscuit, on her bed against a house rule that I have entirely given up enforcing. She is the reason I keep going. And she is the one who, the morning Diane Mercer measured my fence, stood at the kitchen window with a glass of orange juice and watched the whole thing and said, when I came back inside, "Grandpa, why is that lady on our driveway with a tape measure?" I told her I did not know yet, but that I intended to find out, and that the first thing we were going to do was write down everything that had just happened with the date and the time, while it was fresh. Maddie got me the legal pad off the counter. That was the first page. By the end, the folder was 3 inches thick. Cedar Hollow Estates was not always Cedar Hollow Estates. When I surveyed the original tract, it was 412 acres of timber and meadow, owned by a paper company that wanted out and a developer named Pruitt who wanted in. I was 31 years old, and it was the largest single job my young firm had ever landed. I spent the better part of a year on that ground. I walked every foot of it. I set the section corners, ran the perimeter, laid out the road center lines, platted the lots, and tied the whole subdivision to the county's monument system so that every parcel inside it could be found and defended for as long as the records held. When it was done, I recorded the plat at the courthouse, and at the bottom right corner of that plat, the block reserved for the surveyor of record, I signed my name and pressed my seal. That seal has a number on it. That number is mine and no one else's, for as long as I live and for the life of every map I ever made. Here is the part that matters, and I am telling you now so you can watch for it the way I had to wait for it. When Pruitt platted the subdivision, he kept my 3.5 acres out of it. They were already mine. I had bought them from the paper company years before. A separate deed, a separate parcel, surveyed and recorded on its own. Cedar Hollow grew up around my land, like a town growing up around an old farmhouse. But my land was never part of the subdivision. It is not subject to the covenants. It is not inside the association's boundary. It never was. And the line that separates my parcel from the nearest Cedar Hollow lot, the line Diane Mercer was so certain about, is a line I set the iron for with my own hands and recorded and confined blindfolded in the dark. She did not know any of that. To her, I was just the stubborn old man at the top of the road with the unpermitted fence and the gravel drive and the dog, an irritation, an exception she meant to correct. She had been president for 9 years, and in those 9 years, she had grown accustomed to being the one who decided where lines were. I understand how a person gets that way. I have seen it before in clients who confused owning the land with understanding it, and I will tell you that in 36 years of this work, I never once met a property line that cared who was certain about it. Par. The first notice came 8 days after the morning on the driveway. It was a single sheet on association letterhead, and it informed me that a boundary compliance review had determined that my fence encroached upon common area and association-governed land by approximately 11 feet along its northern run, and that I was directed to remove or relocate the fence within 30 days or face a fine of $50 per day. I read it twice. Then I wrote the date and time on the legal pad, noted that the notice cited no survey, no plat, no recorded instrument of any kind. Only the board's determination, and I filed it. Page 4. I did not call Diane Mercer. I did not drive down to the clubhouse and argue. I want you to understand that this was not weakness, and it was not fear. It was the most basic discipline of my old trade. You do not win a boundary dispute by being loud. You win it by being right, and by being able to prove you were right, on paper, in front of someone whose job is to care about the paper. So I did the thing I had done 10,000 times in my working life. I pulled the record. It took me one afternoon at the county recorder's office, a building I had walked into more times than I could count, where the clerk at the counter was the daughter of a clerk I had worked with for 20 years. I requested a certified copy of the recorded plat of Cedar Hollow Estates and a certified copy of the deed and survey for my own parcel, and I gave her the book and page numbers from memory, which made her smile, because almost no one comes to a recorder's counter knowing the book and page. Her name is Renee. She pulled the grade-bound volume down off the shelf and laid it open on the counter, and there it was. I stood there in the quiet of that office, under the hum of the old fluorescent tubes, and looked down at my own signature on a document 40 years old, and my own seal beside it. The number as clear as the day. I pressed it into the wet ink. Renee turned the volume so I could see it square. "That you?" she asked. And I said it was. She ran the certified copies, stamped each one with the county's raised seal, and slid them across the counter. I paid for the copies. $11. I asked her for a second set while I was at it, and a third, and she made them without asking why, because clerks understand that a man who wants 3 certified copies of his own plat has a reason, and the reason is none of their business. I drove home and put them in the folder, and I did not show them to anyone, not yet. The record does no good. Shouted across a driveway. It does its work in the right room at the right time in front of the right people. I could wait. I had waited for property corners to be vindicated by the slow turning of a courthouse before, watched a judge hold a 40-year-old plat up to the light and rule for the dead man who recorded it over the living man who ignored it. This was no different, except that this time the land was mine. It was the following Monday that I learned why Diane Mercer wanted my 11 feet, and it changed the shape of the whole thing. Maddie and I were at the feed store down in the valley, loading bags into the truck, when a man I had known for 30 years, a rancher named Earl Coombs, whose place borders Cedar Hollow on the far side, came across the lot toward me with his hat in his hand. Earl is not a talker. In 30 years, I do not think Earl and I had exchanged more than a few hundred words, most of them about weather and cattle prices. When Earl crosses a parking lot to find you, something is wrong. He set his hat back on his head when he reached me and looked at the bags in my truck bed instead of at my face, which is how Earl delivers bad news. "You hear about the development," he said. It was not a question. I told him I had not. He told me that Cedar Hollow's board had quietly approved a plan to extend the subdivision northward, a new phase, 40 more lots, and that the access road for the whole thing had to come up the ridge along the north side of my property, because there was no other grade a road could climb. 40 lots, he said, and the only way up is past your place. Then he told me the part he had driven across the lot to say. The engineer's drawing for that road, Earl said, ran the new right-of-way 11 feet onto my land. He had seen it himself, at a neighbor's meeting in the clubhouse, projected on a screen, a clean blue line marching straight up the ridge and clipping the corner of a parcel he recognized as mine. I stood there with a bag of feed on my shoulder and did the arithmetic the way you do when you have spent your life turning the world into numbers. 11 feet, the same 11 feet. Not a coincidence. Diane Mercer, was not enforcing a fence rule. She was clearing a path. And Earl told me the last thing, the thing that pulled it all into focus, which was that the developer on the new phase, the man whose company stood to make several $1 million off those 40 lots if the road went through, was a man named Greg Mercer, Diane's husband. "Figured you ought to know who you were really fighting," Earl said, and he touched the brim of his hat and walked back to his own truck, and that was the longest conversation we had ever had. So that was the shape of it. The fine notice was not about a fence. It was about a road, and the road was about money, and the money was her family's. The 11 feet she wanted me to surrender was the 11 feet her husband needed to make his project pencil out. And the easiest way to take 11 feet from an old widower at the top of the road was to convince him, and everyone watching, that the line had always been where the board said it was. I want to be careful here, because I did not know all of that for certain that afternoon. I knew what Earl told me, and Earl is honest. But a thing a rancher tells you in a feed store parking lot is not yet a thing you can put in a folder. So I did what I had always done. I started gathering. I drove to the county planning office the next morning and requested, under the public records process, every document on file for the proposed Cedar Hollow North extension. It took 2 weeks and a small fee, $60 for the copying. And when the packet came, it was 400 pages in a banker's box left on my porch. And on page 61 was the engineer's preliminary road alignment, and the right-of-way ran exactly 11 feet onto parcel 1140, which is my parcel. Which is the only parcel in this county I will never be confused about. I sat at the kitchen table and went through all 400 pages with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, 1 page at a time, the way I had read survey field notes my whole life, and I filed every one of them. The folder needed a second folder. The notices kept coming. That is the nature of the staircase, and I climbed it 1 step at a time, writing the date on each step. The second notice, in the 3rd week, declared me in violation and began the daily fines, retroactive, so that I supposedly already owed several $100s for a fence I had built before the association existed. I filed it. The 3rd came with a letter from the association's attorney, a firm down in the city, threatening to place a lien on my property for the accumulated fines and the cost of the board's abatement if I did not comply. I read that one to Maddie at the kitchen table on a school night, with her homework spread out between us and Biscuit asleep under her chair. I read it flat, the way I would read a weather report, because I did not want her to hear fear in it. Where there was none to hear. She put her pencil down. She asked me if they could really do that, take the house. I told her the truth, which was that they could try a great many things, and that a lien is just a piece of paper that makes a claim, and that a claim has to be proven, and that not one of their claims could survive the document sitting in the folder on the counter behind her. Your grandmother's fence is not going anywhere, I told her. Not the post, not the rail, not 1 inch of it. She looked at the folder, and then at me, and she picked her pencil back up. She believed me. A child should not have to wonder whether her home is solid under her, and the only way I knew to keep her from wondering was to be a man who had already done the boring work that made the answer certain. Then it stopped being letters. On a Thursday in the 5th week, a little after 9 in the morning, a man in a polo shirt with a clipboard and a laminated badge on a lanyard drove up my gravel in a white SUV and got out and began photographing my fence and pacing it off, heel to toe, muttering numbers into a phone. The SUV had a magnetic sign on the door that said Cedar Hollow Estates in a curling font, the kind of sign you peel off at the car wash. His shoes were white sneakers, brand new, and the gravel had already dusted them gray, and and he kept glancing down at them, as if the driveway itself were an inconvenience the board had failed to warn him about. I walked down to the gate, slow, with Biscuit padding along at my knee. I asked him who he was. He told me he was an inspector with the association's compliance division, and that I needed to step back and let him complete his assessment. I asked to see the badge. He held it up just long enough for me to see that it was a piece of plastic with the Cedar Hollow logo printed on it and his name, Brett, in a font you could buy off the internet, laminated at home, the corners not quite square. There is no such thing as an association compliance division with the authority to inspect land. It does not own. I knew that. He did not. Or he did, and was counting on me not knowing it. I did not argue with Brett. I took out my own phone and I photographed him, and his SUV, and his plate, and the badge, and I said, in the level voice I have used on 1,000 job sites, that he was standing on private property that was not subject to his association, that I had not consented to any inspection. Sir, I'd ask you not to interfere with an official compliance walkthrough, he said, and he said the word official the way a boy says a word he has just learned. He told me he would be noting my refusal to cooperate in his report. I told him to note whatever he liked, and to spell my name right, 2 N's. He looked at Biscuit, who had sat down in the middle of the drive and was watching him with the flat patience old dogs reserve for fools. And he decided his assessment was complete. He left. I filed the photographs to 2 drives, the way I have backed up survey data my entire career, because a record that exists in only one place is a record you are gambling with. That was the day Maddie started keeping her phone on the windowsill, angled at the driveway, recording, without my asking her to. She propped it against the sugar jar, so the lens cleared the sill. She is a smart girl. I want to stop the count for a moment and tell you something, because you have been patient with an old man's pace. I have been to a great many property line disputes. I have watched neighbors who had been friends for 30 years stop speaking over 18 inches of weeds. I have seen good people lose ground they were entitled to because they got angry, said something they could not take back. Through the first punch in a fight, the law would have won for them, if they had only kept their hands in their pockets. The land does not reward the loudest voice. It rewards the cleanest record. Keep your folder, walk your boundaries, and let the other fellow be the one who cannot defend what he said. I learned that with a transit in my hands, and I am telling it to you now, across a fence line of my own, by the 6th week, the fines on paper had crossed $2,000, and the attorney's letters had grown teeth. I had still not produced my plat. I want to be honest about why. Part of it was the old surveyor's patience, the knowledge that the document lands hardest in the room where it counts. Part of it, I will admit, was that I wanted to understand the whole scheme before I moved, because a man who shows his best card too early teaches his opponent how to fold and try again from a new direction. Diane Mercer did not know what I held. As long as she did not know, she would keep building her case on a foundation that did not exist. And every brick she laid was a brick that would fall on her when the foundation went. So I let her build. And she built. The 7th step was the one that crossed the line, and it crossed it cleanly. On a Saturday morning the 7th week, I came back from the feed store to find a crew of 3 men at my north fence, with a post puller and a chain, and Brett, the inspector, supervising, and the chain already around my corner post, Carol's post, the one she set 6 inches the way she wanted it. They had a work order, Brett said, signed by the board, authorizing abatement of the encroaching structure. They were going to pull my fence out of the ground. I did 3 things, in order, and none of them was raise my voice. First, I told the men, plainly, that the fence was on a recorded parcel that did not belong to the association, that they had no lawful authority to remove anything, and that if they pulled that post, they would be destroying private property, and I would hold each of them personally responsible. 2 of the 3 men stopped. They were day laborers, not villains. They had been told this was a routine job. The 3rd looked to Brett. 2nd, I called the county sheriff's non-emergency line and reported a crew attempting to remove a fence from my recorded parcel, without my consent and without a court order. 3rd, I looked up at the kitchen window, and Maddie was there, phone steady in both hands, and I gave her the smallest nod, and she kept recording. A deputy came within 20 minutes. His name was Ramirez, and I had never met him, and he did exactly what a good officer does, which is to refuse to take anyone's side until he had the facts. He listened to Brett, who produced the board's work order and a stack of violation notices, and spoke at length about the association's authority and the encroachment and the abatement process. He listened to me, and I said only that the parcel was mine, separately deeded and recorded, that it was not part of Cedar Hollow and never had been, and that I could prove it. Deputy Ramirez told me fairly that a property line dispute was a civil matter and that he could not adjudicate a boundary in my driveway. He also told the crew that no one was pulling any post that day because there was a genuine dispute of ownership and no court order in hand, and that destroying the fence under those circumstances could be criminal mischief regardless of what the board's paper said. He told Brett the board would need to take it to a judge. Then Deputy Ramirez did the thing that mattered. He turned to me and asked almost gently, the way you ask an old man you have decided to be patient with, "Sir, do you actually have something that shows this is your land and not theirs?" And I said yes. And I went inside, and I came back out with the folder. I did not hand him the fines. I did not hand him the letters. I handed him one document, a certified copy of the recorded plat of Cedar Hollow Estates, and I asked him to look at the bottom right corner at the surveyor's block and to read the name and the seal. He did. He read my name on the plat, and then he looked at my driver's license, which I had brought out with it, and then he looked at me. And I said quietly, because there was no need to say it any other way, I surveyed this whole subdivision in 1984. I set that corner. I recorded that plat. The line they say my fence crosses is a line I drew, and my parcel was never part of their association, and it is all right there with my signature on it. They have been fining me for 40 days using my own map. Deputy Ramirez was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to Brett and asked him whether the board, before it sent a crew to tear out a man's fence, had pulled the recorded plat. Brett did not have an answer. Of course he did not. No one on that board had ever read the document that governed every line they claimed to enforce, because reading it had never once occurred to people who believed a line was wherever they said it was. The deputy told the crew to pack up the chain and go home. He told Brett that the sheriff's office would be documenting the incident, and that if anyone touched that fence before a judge said otherwise, there would be charges. And then, before he left, he asked me for a copy of the plat for his report, and I gave him one because I had brought 3. You always bring more than one copy. I have known that since I was 31 years old. That was the reveal, though the word is too dramatic for what it was. There was no shouting. There was a chain coming off a fence post, and a deputy reading a name, and a 40-year-old document doing in 90 seconds what 40 days of certainty could not undo. The line was where I said it was, because it was where I had recorded it, and the record was older than the woman who claimed otherwise, and older than her marriage, and older than the road her husband wanted to build across my pasture. What came after was not revenge. I want to be plain about that, because the audience for a story like this sometimes wants the bad woman ruined. And that is not what happened, and not what I wanted. What happened was consequence, the ordinary kind. The kind that falls on people who build on ground they never checked. I took the folder to a lawyer, a sensible woman named Pat Okafor who practices property law in the county seat, and who, when I laid the plat and the deed and the road alignment side by side on her conference table, sat back in her chair and said one word, which was, well. She filed two things. The first was a response to the association demanding it cease all enforcement against parcel 1140 and rescind every fine, on the simple ground that the parcel was not within the association and never had been, with the recorded plat attached as the only exhibit anyone would ever need. The second was a notice to the County Planning Commission that the proposed North Extension's road alignment crossed private land whose owner had not granted and would not grant an easement, with the same plat attached, and the public records packet showing that the alignment had been drawn straight across a parcel no one on the developer's team had bothered to confirm they could use. The road died at the next Planning Commission meeting. I went. Maddie came with me, in a good shirt, and sat in the second row with her hands folded. And I want you to know she was not afraid that night. She was proud, and she watched. The meeting was held in the county building, in a room with folding chairs and a long table where 5 commissioners sat under bad lighting with paper cups of coffee in front of them. The engineer went first. He had a laptop and a projector and the same clean blue line Earl had described, marching up the ridge, and he spoke for 10 minutes about grades and setbacks and stormwater. And the commissioners nodded the way tired people nod at competent slides. Then my attorney stood. Pat Okafor does not raise her voice. She told the commission in about 4 minutes that 11 feet of the proposed right-of-way crossed recorded private property, and she walked to the table and laid down the plat. And she noted for the record that the surveyor whose seal appeared on that plat, the man who had established every boundary in Cedar Hollow Estates, was sitting in the room, and that the parcel in question was his. One of the commissioners, a woman with reading glasses pushed up into her hair, pulled the plat toward her and looked at the corner block for a long moment, and then looked up over the room until she found me. I did not say anything. I have learned that the document says it better than I can. The commissioners are not partisans. They are people doing a difficult job with limited information, and the information they had just received was that a developer had drawn a road across land he did not own and could not get. The chairman asked the engineer plainly whether the applicant had secured an easement across parcel 1140. The engineer looked at the table where Greg Mercer sat, and Greg Mercer looked at his own hands, and no one answered, because there was no answer that helped them. They tabled the project. Without the ridge alignment, there was no grade for a road, and without a road, there were no 40 lots. Greg Mercer's several $1 million went back to being a drawing in a folder. Here are the numbers, since this is a story that lives and dies on them. In 41 years on that land, the fines the association lawfully collected from me came to $0. The plat that settled the entire matter was recorded 40 years before Diane Mercer decided my fence was in the wrong place. The fines they had assessed against me, every one of them void, had totaled $2,050 on paper. And the development that the whole campaign had been quietly serving, the 40 lots and the road across my pasture, was worth a great deal more than that, and it came to nothing, because its access depended on 11 feet of ground that belonged, by a document bearing my own signature to me. Diane Mercer was not led away in handcuffs. That is not how these things go, and you should not want it to be. What happened to her was smaller, and I think harder. The board that had backed her for 9 years read the plat their own attorney finally pulled, the document they should have pulled before the first notice. And they understood, in an afternoon, what 9 years of certainty had cost them. The association rescinded every fine against me in a single letter, a letter so carefully worded that you could feel the lawyer's embarrassment in it. At the next election, the membership chose a new president, a retired schoolteacher named Joan, who on her second day walked up my gravel drive by herself with no clipboard and knocked on my door and asked, plainly, whether I would be willing to come to a board meeting sometime, explain to the homeowners how the subdivision's boundaries actually worked. Because it had become clear that no one currently serving understood them. I told her I would be glad to. I brought a copy of the plat. I did not bring 3. 1 was enough by then. Greg Mercer's company did not fold, but the North Extension never went forward, and the last I heard, he was trying to assemble access from the far side, across Earl Coombs's ranch, and Earl, who does not forget a thing, told him no. Diane resigned from the board entirely the same month. Her husband's project collapsed. I see her sometimes at the feed store. We do not speak, but she does not look at me with anger anymore. She looks at me the way you look at a thing you walked past for years and never once saw clearly. In the late summer, on the kind of bright, clear evening that makes this whole mountain worth the trouble of staying on it, Maddie and I walked the north fence together. She is taller now than her grandmother was. We checked the corner post, Carol's post, the one set 6 inches the way Carol wanted it, and it had not moved, and it will not, because it is exactly where the record says it should be, and the record is exactly where Carol and I put it on a Saturday in 1983. Maddie ran her hand along the top rail and said she was glad we did not let them take it. I told her it was never theirs to take, and that the reason we got to keep it was not that we shouted the loudest, but that we could prove the quietest, simplest thing, which is where the line is. She nodded. She understood. She had watched the whole of it from a kitchen window with a phone in her hands, and she had learned the lesson I most wanted her to learn, which is the lesson I will leave with you now. If you own land, know your boundaries. Not roughly. Exactly. Walk your lines. Find your pins. Get a certified copy of your recorded deed and your plat and read them and put them somewhere safe. And put a second copy somewhere else, because a record that exists in only one place is a record you are gambling with. When a letter comes telling you that a line is wherever someone has decided it is, do not argue and do not panic. Write down the date and the time. Start the folder. File a public records request if you need to understand what is really driving the demand, because the petty fight on your driveway is very often the visible edge of a larger plan with money behind it. Talk to your neighbors, because someone like Earl Coombs may hand you the whole shape of the thing across a feed store parking lot. And then take your clean, dull, decades-old paper to the room where it counts, the recorder's office, the sheriff, the planning commission, a sensible lawyer's conference table, and let the document do the work that no amount of shouting ever could. The world is slow, and it is not always fair on the morning of the fight, but it rewards the person who kept the records. I have watched it do so for 40 years, with a transit in my hands and a folder under my arm. If you have your own story of a board or an office or a clipboard that decided your line was wherever they said it was, I would like to hear it. Leave it where I can find it, and I will read every one. If this old surveyor's account was worth the time you gave it, you know what to do to see the next one. And the next one is already sitting in a folder on my kitchen table, because not long after the Planning Commission tabled the road, a woman 3 counties over wrote to me about a private lake and a dam her grandfather built, and an association that had decided the water was theirs. That, though, is a story for another evening.